We've seen and heard some very compelling cases for sustained engagement, both for broadening horizons, but also confronting head-on difficult and challenging issues. We have time for one or two questions if we're brief. If anyone would like to ask our distinguished panel. You guys so wowed them.
The same project as? Yeah, they were covering slogans which were sort of full of hate and all kinds of invective. That was the reason it started, actually. That was a sort of impetus for it. And pretty soon it took off, and so then they were really addressing all walls that were, well, barren in that city, which there has no public art at all. I mean, there's public art in the form of submarine chalk, whether there's a old submarine, or there's an old tank, or there's whatever. Our public art is usually the word Allah written, in sort of three-dimensional form, or there are these antiquated forms of military rule that have been there to remind us of our saviors. And that's about all. So I think this was a kind of move to really grab the city back and to do something with it. And it's really taken off because they found that there are lots of now local initiatives. And there are people in parts of town who are taking to the walls themselves and making paintings, or they are doing all kinds of interventions. Whether they are trained or not is immaterial, but the fact is that they're covering over posters that, are about, well, so-and-so is non-Muslim, or so-and-so deserves to die, or whatever. So I think it's it's taken off, it's mushroomed in that city, and the city really requires it, as we know.
Did you say Karachi or Lahore for that?
Huh?
Karachi.
Karachi, this is Karachi, yeah. Lahore has a history of public art. I mean, it's interesting, but there's so many parts of the city now in Lahore where student groups have actually painted walls, got money from local paint factories, and all kinds of messages to do with, peacemaking, environment, whatever they feel is a positive message. And the forms vary from things taken off the internet in terms of images to totally indigenous ways of representing human form or plant form or whatever. So it's incredible. In Lahore, you drive out, which I do to the campus, new building estates have suddenly got walls in which artists, I wouldn't say they're artists, they're just students who've taken to the walls with paint, and they're just painting them, and with slogans and all kinds of things. Yeah, it's very refreshing. Yeah, it's very refreshing. Yeah, it is.
Another question? Stephen?
Yeah, a great presentation, and I particularly want to thank Shahidul for, I have an 18-year-old daughter, and she's never really found any relevance in my work whatsoever, but after meeting him at an earlier conference and the demonstration about the rip in jeans, suddenly she found that there was a use and a relevance to my work. So thank you for that. But my question was, in those presentations, I was really struck by what often comes across from such projects, the idea of how art and artists can help people to see their own identity and others' identities in different ways, and really compelling cases of that. And then we often spend a lot of time talking about how we explain that to those who are skeptical. But I think a more pressing thing for me at the moment is not necessarily those who are skeptical about it. Those who see it works, but will then say, yes, that works, for those who choose to attend art galleries, love art anyway, that that broadens their perspectives, but they tend to be people with fairly broad perspectives in the first place. And I noted both of you were talking about wider engagement. I'm saying both of you, thinking particularly that you both mentioned wider engagement and all sorts of people see this. How important is that? How important is the aspect of the wider reach, the not just people who choose to attend galleries or shows?
Yeah, I think it's about working at many levels. Certainly, when I'll tell you a little story, and I mentioned this earlier on, about how this thing began. I was having a show in Belfast many years ago, and I was staying with Irish friends in a town called Newry, very close to Belfast. And they had a 5-year-old daughter called Karina, and Karina's was moved to mum and dad's room to make room for Uncle Shahidul. And I'm very fond of kids, so we played, we became very good friends. I'm coming back from the exhibition at one stage. I had some coins in my pocket. I'm just emptying my pockets. And Karina sort of comes to the doorway. And usually when she's there, she jumps and runs into my arms and we tell each other stories. But she's where that woman is now, standing there, a bit quizzical. And I say, "What's the matter, Karina?" She says, "You've got money?" I said, "Yes, I've got money." She says, but you're from Bangladesh. No? And, that really was the beginning of what I started to do, because I was aware that a 5-year-old girl grew up in an environment where she was incapable of seeing a Bangladeshi as anything other than an icon of poverty. And it's similar with Islam. I mean, a Muslim has to be a certain type of person. So I have to have 4 wives whom I beat terribly and do all sorts of horrible things. And that's a perception I carry regardless of who I am. So we decided to work across the spectrum. So firstly was a platform for creating, for allowing local storytellers to tell the stories, so a different narrative could come about. Then we needed warriors, so we set up the school. Then, in '94, I had a show in Arles, in France, and I took 2 young photographers with me. And I looked at the transformation that had taken place, because they had gone to this festival. Abbas, my friend, was the chairman of Magnum, and he took them around the corridors of Magnum. So these kids were on cloud 9. And I knew I couldn't take a suitcase full of kids to these festivals. So I decided to take the festival to them. And that's how we began our festival. And then we've started other things. But I do remember I had a show in '89 at the Goethe Institute. And I invited my friends, well-to-do friends, artists, but also guards and janitors at companies I'd worked for. And I gave them all my cards. And I asked them if they'd gone to the show. And not one of them had gone to the show. And I said, "Well, you're my mates. I invited you." And they said, "Would they have let us in?" There is no rule that says a poor person can't get into a gallery, but in our sort of countries, and in most countries, you can tell by looking who the class differences are so acute. So another guard would probably have stopped this guard from going in because he would feel he was doing his job. And if someone did come in, people like you and me, through our looks, would make that person know that that wasn't his or her space. So what we started to do was to take our gallery to the streets. So we have this fabulous festival where we have work by Salgado and Maimuna, has been shown there. But we take a truncated form of that, put it on rickshaw vans, and they go around the streets of Dhaka. They go to bazaars, to school play fields, to football grounds, on boats across rivers. We've actually done international traveling shows where we've done them on donkeys, on camels, on tuk-tuks, wherever it's been. When we did it in Sri Lanka, we actually invited, this was a show on HIV and AIDS, and we invited the tuk-tuk drivers and talked about the concept. So they became the curators and the traveling ambassadors. So when they stopped at the train station and people came, it was the tuk-tuk drivers who explained what this show was about and things like that. And that really has transformed things. And I was telling about the closure of Crossfire. It's very interesting. A lot of our work is very political, and there are not many galleries that will show our work. So the reason why we set up our gallery was because we, apart from other reasons, we could show work that others would not dare to show. But when we tried to show work which was very critical of their Ershad regime, that was how I started my photography, the art college refused to show it because it was photography and therefore not art. Yeah? That persists to an extent. But when the Crossfire show was closed down, students of the art college came out into the streets to say, closing down the Drake Gallery is like banning painting. So we've been able to get a complete reversal and buy-in from communities which in the past had, in a sense, distanced us. And I think that is really where we want to be. And the reason the court was able to rule in favor of us was because there were people in the streets of my country coming out in protest, forming human chains, because they were not prepared to have the government close down our gallery.
Yes, and I think it's the same. I think artists are becoming increasingly aware. Some of them have always been aware of the fact that certain kinds of expression has a wider outreach. Certainly in India and Pakistan, you know, for example, poetry. Poets are like rock stars, you know, in the sense that you have a mushaira and there thousands of people come. So the artist, I think the visual artist looks with envy at this kind of an audience. And I think more and more the idea of breaking out of the gallery system is something that engages young artists especially, who are much more interested in doing some work in which there is not necessarily documentation, but there is a feeling that, okay, you have actually practiced what you have learned. So it's very, very critical, and some of these initiatives are like that, in which, for example, in that minority women thing that we did, there was this group who worked on embroideries, and they were in Peshawar. And it was not possible for them, for various reasons, to come to Lahore to be at the opening. And we could not take the show to Peshawar because of the security situation, because it was soon after the killing of those school children in the school in Peshawar. So we had all these women gather in a house, and they came to the show on Skype. And we talked to them, and you know, they were talking, and they were looking at the audiences, looking at their work, and they kept sending for them so they could talk to them and, you know, find out what their response was to their work. So I think that this desire for direct communication at various levels is extremely strong. And I think the revolution, technological revolution that we have in place, except when you have a blackout and there's no electricity, is something that is absolutely tangible, and it's something that one encourages constantly.
I'd like to thank our panel once again. I'm glad we were able to open up our conference this morning to the public so that we could share some of these very compelling and passionate stories. And even as our participants move on to some private roundtable discussions, I hope the rest of you will carry this conversation beyond the walls of La Pietra. Thank you.